guys, so we are in London during Token 2049 and here with you Anna Tutova, co-founder of Quidd Telegram Media, and our guest Yat Siu, founder of one of the most famous gaming blockchain funds in the industry, Animoca Brands. Great to have you, Yat.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So can you tell about your background and how did you get involved into gaming industry?
Well, I really got into the gaming industry actually as a kid. I grew up in Austria, in Vienna, and I was basically actually in the music space. My parents were musicians. I studied music, and through that, I ended up using a computer to help me basically get into MIDI software. I programmed some software, uploaded it on a pre-internet service called CompuServe, and a company called Atari discovered me and said, "Oh, we like the software that you wrote." Asked me to come into the office and basically offered me they thought they'd offer me a job. I was a kid back then, but anyway, I got the opportunity to work with Atari. Atari was one of the very earliest gaming companies out there. So that's how I got started. So in the 80s, I started working for Atari, which at the time was probably one of the most important gaming companies, making video game consoles. And then since then, I was engaged in sort of the world of the internet business as well as the gaming business. Doing online games back in the early 2000s, as well as office with Animoca, which basically started really in 2010, 2011, if you think about it, in the area of mobile games.
So what was your role in Atari? On which side were you?
What?
What was your role in Atari? On which side were you?
Oh, for the Atari, I was generally working on the Atari ST. The Atari ST was a sort of, back then Atari also made computers. It had the MIDI port, so I could basically do sort of music software on it. And I was generally doing a lot of multimedia activity. And then later on, I was also basically helping do work on the Jaguar. The Jaguar was the last Atari console, from that generation.
And how did you discover blockchain, crypto, NFTs? What did you discover first, actually?
I think everyone has heard of Bitcoin and so on at that point in time, but I wasn't really that interested in Bitcoin and crypto because it was a fairly financial instrument, right? That wasn't really what interested me. How we really got into the space was when we discovered CryptoKitties. In fact, the background story is that we were just about to acquire a studio called Fuel Powered that was working on this little project called CryptoKitties together with Axiom Zen. And this was in 2017. And when we saw, if you remember, when CryptoKitties first launched, it basically broke Ethereum. Everyone was just breeding kitties. It was just kind of crazy. It was like, what's going on here? And we discovered basically the power of true digital ownership through this thing called non-fungible tokens, NFTs. And this studio was one that we had acquired, and its co-founder, the co-founder of Fuel Powered, ended up becoming a co-founder of what became Dapper Labs. We ended up becoming, early shareholders in Dapper Labs, as well as the publishers of CryptoKitties in our part of the world, in Greater China. And that actually sort of really ushered us into that space. And ever since then, in really 2018, we decided that we thought of non-fungible tokens and true digital ownership as the actual way in which we can have true ownership in games. That was sort of how it started. And in order to facilitate that, we had to make many investments because we were also new to the space. Because remember, we didn't come from the crypto background, right? We were generally new players in that space. So what did we do is we made early investments in companies like OpenSea and Wax and Decentraland. We acquired the Sandbox.
From where did you get your deal flow at that time?
Well, it was kind of easy because there was very few companies doing NFT stuff, right? In 2018, there was a small conference in Hong Kong called Nifty's. And at that point, if you remember, the crypto market was like absolutely down, right? The people talk about today as being a winter and, it's pretty chilly, but, I think the real winter or the ice age was actually in 2018, 2019. And so there was a small conference in Hong Kong that was organized to bring all the NFT people together. And there was like 250, like very small, right? And I think almost all the people that we met, we ended up investing or working with because that was the core group of believers, right? That's where we met OpenSea. That's where we met Axie Infinity. That's where we met, Sandbox and all those people that we had already started talking to in some cases. Wax, Decentraland as well, right? And that was the beginning of it. So I would say it was pretty easy to find them because also nobody was going to invest in them, right? We were the only ones who were willing to support them at that moment in time. And we were a very small company back then, so we didn't have that much money, right? So the investment round in OpenSea, the entire investment round was like $2 million, for instance, right? Or like Axie Infinity, that entire round was $800,000. That was their seed round. We were the lead investor, right? That was a long time ago.
Were there companies into which you decided at that time not to invest, or you just invested into everybody because
no, I think, I mean, there were companies we didn't invest in as well. So I think it was at the time, but it was very easy at the time to identify which were the companies that we thought we could work with. The important parameter why we made the investment wasn't specifically around did we think that this was the best company. I mean, we obviously wanted them to be successful. It was the kind of companies we thought we could work well together with, right? And that was sort of the reason we made those investments. We hoped that we could work together and collaborate. And so that was the reason, because we're not a VC. Like a lot of people look at us and say, oh, we've done over 380 investments. But actually, we're not a fund. Right? So most, if not all of the investments sit on our balance sheet. We invest for ecosystem growth. We don't necessarily invest because we believe that the return will be in this particular company will be strong versus the other, and that's a sort of important part of our investment philosophy.
And at that time, were those your own funds, or did you raise a small fund when you just started?
We didn't have a fund, but we invested out of our balance sheet. But we were also a small public company in Australia, so we did raise money from the capital markets, but the capital market raising was like 1 million, 2 million, right? It was much smaller than it is today. And that's basically how we started it. And being a public company in Australia did help us, navigate that early part in the industry, which we're grateful for.
And now we see generally continuing development of the gaming metaverse. NFTs are quite down now, but
right.
Still there is something happening. And there are basically your today's panel
yes.
Was on the NFT royalties, and
yes.
we see that some companies make it arbitrary, and not always
yes.
creators will get royalties.
Yes.
And you issued a license for the preservation of royalty payments. Can
yes.
you tell more about this and
yeah.
why royalties are important?
So, I mean, I think let's start off why royalties are important, right? Royalties are so important because it's really the best way to give value back to the creators. And it's not just a question of, is it fair or not? I mean, that's an important part, because I think creators ought to receive, fair reward for the work that they're doing. It's also the fact that giving value to the creator this way ensures decentralization. Because what you want to make sure is that the power structure, right? Like, power centralization happens when money centralizes as well. So when you have a lot of money that is basically accumulated into a single source, say like a marketplace, right? Then they end up becoming the ones that are controlling it. Vis-a-vis, for instance, if you actually end up distributing the value of money across multiple creators, then actually what you're also doing is you're distributing the power around, right? So royalties is actually not just a way of giving a reward to the creators, it's also a way to ensure that Web3 and decentralization stays alive, right? So that's number one, right? That's a big component. The other thing that's, I think, a key thing is that we don't like the fact that some marketplaces who make royalties optional don't ask the creator if it's their choice, right? So in a way, it's basically a little bit like, in the worst case, it's theft, but in, maybe the mildest case is unethical, right? And one of the reasons we decided to do it as a legal approach is because many of the creators don't actually know how to draft a legal agreement. They don't know how to read a contract. An artist, first thing is not to hire a lawyer, right? The first thing they do is make the art or make the painting or make music. They don't think about hiring a lawyer. So we decided that by releasing a contract, basically sort of a license agreement, in sort of Creative Commons open source manner, it allows them to adapt it for their purposes so that they can be protected at least legally. Now, what the legal agreement does is it simply says that royalties are part of the agreement when you want to buy these NFTs. What it also says is that if someone facilitates a sale without paying royalties, then they are liable for it. Right? That means they have a responsibility to pay for it. It's almost a little bit like piracy, or a little bit like digital copyright. So the consequence then is that who's responsible for it? The marketplace. So in other words, what we're hoping for is that if the marketplace becomes responsible for the royalties in a legal way, then they have to enforce the royalties regardless of whether it is done through a smart contract or not, right? Which is how it's always been happening before. So that's kind of the high level of why we decided to do that.
Should there be a limit on the amount of interest of the payments of royalties?
I think there's a conversation around that. Some people were saying, because the value of the NFT might have declined, therefore, it's not fair to pay more royalties, all that kind of stuff. So to me, this is a question that has to be negotiated with the creator, right? Some creators might say, okay, but maybe some creators don't take the opinion that the reason you buy the NFT is for value, right? Sometimes you buy NFTs for different reasons, right? So it depends on a case-by-case basis, and I think needs to be basically negotiated and thought for by the creator themselves. To me, the strong creators will think about what is the best way to engage the community. At the end of the day, if you charge a high royalty and there's another kind of art or another kind of NFT collection that is maybe just as good but charges a low royalty, that's competition.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, maybe he has to reduce his royalty in order to keep that customer to go to him. The point is that the creators decided that, not the marketplace.
And as well, you announced at Web Summit the launch of Open Metaverse Alliance, which you are part of. Can
Yes.
you tell what it is and what?
The Open Metaverse Alliance goal is to basically set a way in which you have more interoperable standards between what we do with non-fungible tokens and assets and digital assets in the Open Metaverse. I think this is really important because there's other metaverse groups that have come together, but they're not about an open metaverse. They want to create APIs and access and so on. And for us, when we talk about interoperability, it starts with digital ownership. That's the core of it, right? And the Open Metaverse Alliance, I think Robbie is more involved in that, but I think there's maybe 600-700 people already signed up for the Open Metaverse Alliance. Many of them are our portfolio companies, but many are also other companies that are involved. And it's very exciting to see what's happening there, because really what's taking place is people coming together, understanding how we can all work together in a sort of in a collaborative manner. And again, it's the freedom of choice for the actual sort of owners to determine what to do with the assets. And so, the Open Metaverse Alliance is there to hope and establish these type of new frameworks for collaboration and interoperability.
And what is Metaverse for you now? Like, it's some kind of trendy word, and everybody calls any game Metaverse, but what exactly Metaverse is, in your opinion?
I mean, from our thought, Open Metaverse or the Metaverse begins with true digital property rights. And so things like VR and AR and all these type of things is a way to experience your metaverse, but it isn't the metaverse itself. Right? And the reason we want to focus on true digital property rights is that if we don't own it, if we don't share a part in that experience, then it doesn't mean anything, right? It's a rented experience, right? And so we start from that foundation, right? It's basically the foundation of, in this case, digital sovereignty. The fact that it is really mine and therefore a part of me. That's kind of the identity layer, shall we say, in terms of what it means to be in the metaverse.
And you travel quite a lot, so you're based in Hong Kong, and I remember you mentioned in some of your speeches that you consider Asia to be the best place, and it has the biggest amount of gamers. As well, you have office here in London,
right.
Which you just launched, and as well you recently traveled to Middle East too.
Yes.
So which regions do you think the most active in terms of gaming and
well, I mean, I think it's a global trend, obviously, when you think about sort of Web3 adoption and blockchain gaming in general. However, Asia has momentarily an interesting advantage. The first one is that in Asia, people love blockchain games. People are adopting NFTs much faster. You don't have the same resistance. Whereas, for instance, when you look at America, quite a few, not the majority, but quite a few gamers actually don't like NFTs. But I think the reason they don't like NFTs doesn't have anything to do with necessarily ownership. I think they do want ownership, but they are not liking capitalism. So when they look at crypto and NFT and Bitcoin as one category, to them that's digital capitalism. And digital capitalism to them feels sort of wrong from their perspective. And if you take a look at America, in the last 20, 30 years, for most of the young people in America, capitalism has not worked for them, right? It's harder to buy a house, it's harder to get opportunities, all that kind of stuff, right? So I think it's the same thing here when you look at sort of digital capitalism. Now, when you basically go on something, say like Asia, and I say this sometimes, which is that the American dream is much more alive and well in Asia. I would also say the American dream is probably more alive and well in probably the Middle East, right? And in these places, people understand the benefit of capitalism, and therefore things like ownership matters, because you can't have capitalism without actual ownership, right? If you don't have property rights, you can't have capitalism, and you can't have economic freedom, right? So they're all kind of tied to each other. So if you look at what's happening in Korea, for instance, or in Japan, like in Japan, the Prime Minister announced that Web3 and Metaverse is national agenda, right? If you look at Hong Kong, just last week, yes, exactly, in Korea too. Just last week in Hong Kong, for instance, you have the Hong Kong government, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, talking about NFTs, talking about a virtual asset regime, talking about sort of potential retail trading, all these type of things that they're talking about that many other places aren't sort of doing or thinking about right now. So Hong Kong is trying to be a leader in digital assets. So again, to me, this is a demonstration that Asia as a market seems to be, at least for the time being, more ready for it. But that doesn't mean that they are the only ones doing it. You see in America, everyone's building in it. The only difference is that the regulation in America is not clear. You don't have the president saying we must enter the metaverse, right? And not yet anyway, yeah.
And Americans, one of, there are around 27 million crypto users in US, and they're as well one of the most active. And what activities do you see just in terms of NFTs buying? Which regions are the most active?
I think Asia is definitely one of the most active, but America has a lot of NFT buyers as well. I think the dynamic, we think most of the growth will come initially through sort of gaming NFTs. And what you see, for instance, like for products like GAMEE or Phantom Galaxies, most of the people buy the NFTs, they don't sell them, right? They use them in the game, so they don't trade them. So the volume of trade is low, but the activity of gameplay is very high. And I think that's kind of exciting. And you kind of see the same thing with Sandbox as well, right? So that's kind of one area of activity that's growing really fast. But the one part that we're very excited about right now is also education NFTs. What we're doing with publisher NFTs, where teachers who make content can actually make money selling, their IP, the content they've created that other sort of teachers or parents are using. And just most recently, it was a very small sort of sale of just 6 NFTs for 6 teachers. It generated $230,000 US.
Oh,
now,
awesome.
For teachers, that's basically their annual salary, or very substantial. And I think this is a good example of how NFTs can go beyond gaming and into other areas, and beyond art, but also into all areas of utility in our life.
And do you have any favorite NFTs?
Well, I don't have, and I have many NFTs in my collection, so it's hard to say, asking your favorite NFT is a little bit like asking what's your favorite child, right? But of course, I'm very fond of my Bored Apes. I'm very fond of the land and Sandbox. Most recently also the Cool Cats, right? And of course, every game, I do try to play every one of our games. So I do have a very big collection of NFTs.
Do you invest as well on secondary markets? Buying
Yes.
any altcoins on exchanges?
So personally, I sometimes do that, but I don't have that much time, right? Most of the time I do it because, my son is, who's very much a degen trader and sort of active, and he's like, oh, you should look at this. Okay, it's not a lot, it's mostly for fun, right? I don't really have time to trade. Yeah.
How old is your son?
He's 18.
So does he run his own project, or he just
yeah, no, he works for a crypto company. He's a smart contract developer, so he's doing the stuff, but he started when he was 15, basically trading NFTs and obviously doing tokens. Yeah.
That's good to start early.
Yes, absolutely. It gives you absolutely an edge. Yeah.
So can you share some altcoins you're buying?
No, I would say generally I don't comment about the altcoins that I'm buying. So generally speaking, I'm mostly supportive of everything within our ecosystem. Yeah.
And can you share some of your recent investments in Animoca Brands?
Well, I think some of our most recent investments are, for instance, if you look at TinyTap, that was an acquisition that we did. And then
it was like a few months back.
It was, but then it was one example that we put forward, right? One of our most recent investments that we made is MetaGood, right? Which is basically the sort of NFT for goods, for instance. And a series of other game investments. We have a venture team that is very actively making investments it's interesting, you know, like at the opening that we had in London, I was basically saying hello to a lot of investment portfolios that I never knew, because obviously in the early days I was doing all the deals, but today we have such a big team that I can't be doing all the deals myself, right? So it's changed a little bit, yeah.
So do you still continuously invest actively during this bear market?
Yes,
and
we do.
What exactly are you looking for? What are
Everything we look for,
factors?
everything we look for is about things that enhance the network effect for non-fungible tokens, as well as for sort of aiding the distribution and reach of NFTs. You know, the macro is there's 3.4 billion people who play games. There's only a few million people who play blockchain games. Somewhere in between, we believe there's going to be growth, right? And so from that perspective, also, that unlike the Web 2 world, in Web 3, the network effect is shared. So even if one game, like if you remember when Axie Infinity became really big, it wasn't just Axie that was successful. Every other GameFi project increased in value or in activity as well. So we think that relationship ends up becoming really, really sort of mutual. And so that's part of our strategy as well, right? Basically to help grow sort of the entire ecosystem. Yeah.
And can you share some upcoming plans for Animoca?
Somewhat?
Some plans for the development of Animoca. How do you see the development of industry as well?
I mean, we're very positive about the industry. I know that the market has been shaky, but again, you know, at least the good news is that our audience, which is a lot of the gamers who are going for the first time into blockchain, they don't trade on FTX, right? You know, this is their first token experience. The majority of our users, even in Sandbox, are people who have never had crypto before, right? So I would say that, you know, while the macro, obviously in broad crypto hasn't been great, for the people playing blockchain games, it hasn't really affected them as much, right, for the time being. And that's our focus, and we will continue to try to onboard. And of course, you should expect to see a lot more from TinyTap as well, you know, with different projects. You know, very excited about what's happening with Phantom Galaxies with AAA games. And also if you look at, for instance, what GAMEE is doing with onboarding casual games, I actually think that as well is demonstrating an example of how we can bring casual gamers into blockchain. Each of these are experiments that we're investing and supporting, and we're very hopeful.
Yeah, so hope to see more exciting games
Yes.
on your side,
Yeah.
and that it will help to grow industry and for the mass adoption.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you too.
Yes.